Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the crown for 23 years. His weathered hands, marked by countless training sessions and ceremonial duties, gripped the ornate halberd that had been passed down through generations of royal guards. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Ravencrest Palace, where he stood at his post with the same unwavering dedication he had shown since the day he first donned the crimson and gold uniform. The palace grounds were unusually quiet that Tuesday morning. Most of the staff were preparing for the arrival of Lady Seraphina Blackwood, who was set to marry Prince Edmund within the month. The wedding preparations had consumed the entire palace for weeks, with servants rushing about like busy ants, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and ensuring every detail met the exacting standards of royal protocol. Marcus watched from his position near the Queen's garden entrance as a small golden-brown corgi bounded across the perfectly manicured lawn. Princess, the beloved companion of the late Queen Eleanor, had been roaming the palace grounds since her mistress's passing 3 months ago. The little dog seemed lost without her royal companion, often wandering the halls and gardens as if searching for someone who would never return. The sight of Princess always stirred something deep in Marcus's chest. He had been there the day Queen Eleanor first brought the puppy to the palace 15 years ago. A young corgi with eyes full of mischief and a tail that never seemed to stop wagging. The Queen had named her Princess as a joke, saying that the little dog acted more regal than half the nobility who visited the court. Over the years, Marcus had watched the bond between Queen Eleanor and Princess grow stronger. The dog was more than a pet. She was a confidant, a source of comfort during difficult times, and a constant companion during the Queen's daily walks through the gardens. Princess had her own small throne in the Queen's private chambers, her own chef, who prepared special meals, and a collection of jeweled collars that rivaled some of the crown jewels themselves. When Queen Eleanor fell ill last winter, Princess rarely left her side. The little corgi would curl up at the foot of the royal bed, her intelligent eyes watching every movement, as if she could somehow will her beloved mistress back to health. During the Queen's final days, Princess had been there, a warm and comforting presence in those dark hours. Marcus remembered the day the Queen passed away. Princess had refused to leave the bedside for hours, whimpering softly and nudging at the still form with her nose, unable to understand why her human wouldn't respond to her gentle touches. The sight had brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic palace staff members. Since that day, Princess had become everyone's responsibility and no one's at the same time. The palace staff fed her and cared for her basic needs, but the dog seemed to drift through her days like a ghost of her former self. She would often be found sitting in the Queen's favorite chair in the morning room, or lying on the rug beside the now empty royal bed, waiting for someone who would never return. King Henry, the Queen's widowed husband, had shown little interest in the dog since his wife's passing. Grief had changed him from a warm and engaging monarch into a distant figure who spent most of his time locked away in his study, dealing with state affairs and avoiding anything that reminded him of his beloved Eleanor. The sight of Princess was clearly painful for him, a living reminder of all he had lost. This morning, as Marcus stood at his post, he noticed Princess behaving differently. Instead of her usual aimless wandering, she seemed to be moving with purpose, heading toward the palace's main entrance. Her ears were perked up, and there was an energy in her step that had been missing for months. Lady Seraphina Blackwood's carriage had arrived earlier than expected. Marcus could see it through the ornate iron gates. A magnificent black coach with gold trim and the Blackwood family crest emblazoned on its sides. 4 white horses stamped impatiently as footmen prepared to assist the future princess from her carriage. Marcus had mixed feelings about Lady Seraphina. She was undeniably beautiful, with cascading auburn hair and striking green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with calculating precision. She carried herself with the confidence of someone born to nobility, her posture perfect, her mannerisms refined. Yet there was something about her that Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on, something that made him feel uneasy whenever she visited the palace. Perhaps it was the way she looked at the palace staff, as if they were merely fixtures in her new domain, rather than people who had served the royal family faithfully for decades. Or maybe it was how she seemed to dismiss anything connected to the late Queen Eleanor, referring to the beloved monarch's possessions and traditions as outdated relics that needed to be modernized. Prince Edmund, bless his heart, seemed completely smitten with his bride-to-be. The young prince, barely 25 years old, had inherited his father's kind heart, but lacked the political savvy that had made King Henry such an effective ruler. Edmund saw only Seraphina's beauty and charm, missing the subtle signs that concerned more experienced observers like Marcus. As Lady Seraphina stepped from her carriage, Princess suddenly broke into a run toward the palace entrance. The little dog's tail was wagging furiously, and for a moment, Marcus felt a surge of hope. Perhaps Princess had finally begun to move past her grief and was ready to welcome new people into her life. But as he watched the scene unfold, Marcus realized that Princess wasn't running toward Lady Seraphina with joy. The dog's body language was different, more defensive than welcoming. Her ears were slightly back, and though her tail wagged, it was the cautious wag of a dog trying to assess a potential threat, rather than the enthusiastic greeting of a happy companion. Lady Seraphina noticed the approaching Corgi and stopped in her tracks. Her perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something that might have been annoyance or disdain before her practiced smile returned. She looked down at Princess with the same calculating gaze she used when examining the palace's art collection, as if trying to determine the dog's value and usefulness. "What a charming creature," Lady Seraphina said, in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. Her tone was polite but cool, the kind of voice one might use when commenting on an unremarkable piece of furniture. Princess approached cautiously, sniffing at the lady's elaborate silk gown with its layers of expensive fabric and intricate embroidery. The dog's behavior was polite but reserved, lacking the immediate acceptance she had shown to most visitors during Queen Eleanor's lifetime. Marcus watched as Lady Seraphina reached down toward Princess, her movement hesitant and somewhat awkward. It was clear that she was not comfortable around animals, despite her attempt to appear gracious and welcoming. Her gloved hand hovered uncertainly above the dog's head, as if she wasn't quite sure what to do next. She was Queen Eleanor's constant companion, Prince Edmund said, as he emerged from the palace to greet his fiancée. His voice carried the warmth and affection that had always characterized his relationship with both his late mother and her beloved pet. "Princess has been having a difficult time since Mother passed away. I think she's still looking for her." Lady Seraphina's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How touching," she said, finally giving Princess a brief, perfunctory pat on the head. The dog accepted the gesture politely but without enthusiasm, then took a step back and sat down, watching the lady with intelligent, assessing eyes. Marcus found himself holding his breath as he observed this first meeting between Princess and the woman who would soon become the new queen. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain, a sense that something important was happening beneath the surface of polite conversation and royal protocol. Prince Edmund, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued chatting enthusiastically about the wedding preparations and his excitement about showing Seraphina around the palace. He spoke of his plans to modernize certain aspects of royal life while maintaining the traditions that made their kingdom special. Lady Seraphina listened with apparent interest, occasionally asking questions that seemed designed to gather information rather than express genuine curiosity. When she inquired about the palace staff, her questions focused on efficiency and costs, rather than the welfare of the people who had served the royal family faithfully for generations. As they moved toward the palace entrance, Princess followed at a distance, her behavior careful and observant. Marcus noticed that the little dog kept glancing back toward him, as if seeking reassurance or perhaps testing whether he was paying attention to what was happening. The group paused at the grand entrance, where the palace's senior staff had assembled to formally greet the future queen. Butler Harrison, who had served the royal family for over 40 years, stepped forward with the dignified bearing that had made him a trusted advisor to both the late Queen Eleanor and King Henry. "Your Ladyship," Butler Harrison said with a deep bow, "it is our honor to welcome you to Ravencrest Palace. We look forward to serving you with the same dedication we showed to Queen Eleanor." Lady Seraphina accepted the greeting graciously. But Marcus noticed that her response lacked the warmth that Queen Eleanor had always shown to the palace staff. Where the late queen had known every servant by name and often inquired about their families and well-being, Lady Seraphina's acknowledgement was formal and distant. As the introductions continued, Princess wandered closer to where Marcus stood at his post. The little dog sat down beside his boots, looking up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of palace memories. Marcus reached down carefully, mindful of his ceremonial duties, and gave Princess a gentle scratch behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, seeking the comfort and familiarity that had become so rare in her life since Queen Eleanor's passing. "She remembers you," a voice said softly beside him. Marcus turned to see Mrs. Catherine Wells, the head housekeeper, approaching with a look of concern on her weathered face. Mrs. Wells had been like a second mother to Prince Edmund growing up, and her opinions about palace affairs were highly valued by those who knew her well. "She remembers everyone who was kind to her and the Queen," Mrs. Wells continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Animals have a way of sensing things, you know. They see past the pretty dresses and polite words." Marcus nodded slightly, understanding the deeper meaning in Mrs. Wells' words. The housekeeper had always been an astute judge of character, and her subtle warning didn't go unnoticed. As if sensing that she was being discussed, Princess looked toward the palace entrance where Lady Seraphina was still receiving greetings from the staff. The dog's posture remained alert but guarded, her tail still but not fearful. It was the stance of an animal that was reserving judgment, waiting to see how events would unfold. The formal greetings concluded, and Prince Edmund began guiding Lady Seraphina on a tour of the palace's main floors. As they moved through the ornate corridors, Princess followed at a distance, her presence a quiet reminder of the palace's recent loss and the uncertainty of its future. Marcus remained at his post, but his attention was divided between his ceremonial duties and his concern for the little Corgi who had become an unofficial symbol of the palace's connection to its beloved late queen. He couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting between Princess and Lady Seraphina was more significant than it appeared on the surface. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself thinking about the changes that would soon sweep through Ravencrest Palace. A new queen meant new traditions, new priorities, and inevitably, new ways of doing things. While change was natural and sometimes necessary, Marcus worried about what might be lost in the process. The late Queen Eleanor had created a palace culture based on kindness, respect, and genuine care for all who lived and worked within its walls. Her legacy lived on in the dedication of the staff, the loyalty of subjects like Marcus, and in the simple presence of a small Corgi who had been her constant companion. As he stood guard that morning, watching Princess settle into a patch of sunlight near his post, Marcus made a silent promise. Whatever changes lay ahead, whatever challenges might arise, he would continue to honor the memory of Queen Eleanor and protect the things that truly mattered. Sometimes, he reflected, the smallest acts of loyalty were the most important ones of all. The story of Princess and her place in the changing world of Ravencrest Palace was just beginning, and Marcus suspected that the little dog would play a more important role in the palace's future than anyone might imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Lady Seraphina's first official visit to Ravencrest Palace, and the atmosphere within the ancient walls had begun to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Captain Marcus Thornfield noticed these changes during his daily rounds, observing details that others might overlook, but that spoke volumes about the direction the palace was heading. The most obvious change was in the staff's demeanor. Where once there had been a warm bustle of activity, with servants chatting quietly as they worked and sharing small moments of camaraderie during their duties, now there was a more formal, almost nervous energy. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached, and the easy familiarity that had characterized life under Queen Eleanor's reign was gradually being replaced by a more rigid hierarchy. Lady Seraphina had moved into the palace the previous week, taking up residence in the guest wing while preparations for her marriage to Prince Edmund continued. Her presence was felt throughout the building, not just because of her frequent meetings with wedding planners and decorators, but because of the new expectations she had begun to establish. The first casualty of these changing expectations had been the morning tea gatherings that Mrs. Wells traditionally held for the senior staff. These informal meetings had served as both a way to coordinate daily activities and a means of maintaining the close-knit community that made Ravencrest Palace feel like more than just a workplace. Lady Seraphina had politely suggested that such gatherings were inefficient, and that staff time would be better spent on their individual duties. Marcus had seen the hurt in Mrs. Wells' eyes when she quietly canceled the gatherings, though the loyal housekeeper had accepted the change without complaint. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Marcus understood that small changes often preceded larger ones, and he wondered what other traditions might be deemed unnecessary in the weeks to come. Princess had been struggling with the changes as well. The little Corgi seemed to sense the shift in the palace's atmosphere and had become increasingly restless. She spent more time wandering the corridors, often appearing at Marcus's post as if seeking reassurance that at least some things remained constant in her changing world. On this particular morning, Marcus was stationed near the Queen's garden when he noticed Princess behaving unusually. Instead of her typical aimless wandering, the dog was pacing back and forth near the garden gate, her ears perked up and her body tense with anticipation. Every few minutes, she would look toward the palace entrance and then back toward the garden, as if torn between two impulses. The source of Princess's agitation became clear when Lady Seraphina emerged from the palace, accompanied by a woman Marcus didn't recognize. The stranger was elegantly dressed in a charcoal gray suit and carried herself with the professional bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with wealthy clients. A leather portfolio tucked under her arm suggested she was there on business rather than a social call. "This entire area needs to be redesigned," Lady Seraphina was saying as they approached the garden entrance. Her voice carried the confident tone of someone who was accustomed to having her opinions valued and implemented. "The current layout is far too sentimental and impractical. We need something more sophisticated, more befitting a modern royal residence." The woman with the portfolio nodded attentively, occasionally making notes as Lady Seraphina gestured toward different sections of the garden. Marcus realized she must be a landscape architect, brought in to transform the space that had been Queen Eleanor's pride and joy. Princess had stopped pacing and was now sitting very still, watching the two women with an intensity that Marcus found remarkable. The little dog's entire body was rigid with attention, as if she understood that something important was being decided and wanted to bear witness to whatever was about to unfold. "The rose garden here," Lady Seraphina continued, pointing to a carefully cultivated section, where dozens of varieties bloomed in carefully planned succession throughout the growing season, is completely outdated. Those old-fashioned varieties take up far too much space for such minimal visual impact. I'm thinking something more contemporary. Perhaps a series of geometric hedge patterns with a central water feature. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the casual dismissal of Queen Eleanor's beloved roses. The late queen had spent countless hours in that garden, not just admiring the flowers, but working alongside the gardeners, learning about soil composition and pruning techniques, developing new hybrid varieties that had become famous throughout the kingdom. The landscape architect was nodding enthusiastically, clearly eager to secure what would undoubtedly be a lucrative commission. "I completely understand your vision, your ladyship. The geometric approach is very much in fashion right now. Clean lines, minimal maintenance, maximum impact. We could have the old plantings removed within a week and begin installation of the new design immediately." "Excellent," Lady Seraphina replied. "I want this completed well before the wedding. Our guests should see that Ravencrest Palace is moving into the future, not dwelling in the past." As the two women moved deeper into the garden, discussing their plans to transform Queen Eleanor's sanctuary into something more contemporary, Princess suddenly stood up and began following them. The dog's movement was purposeful but cautious, as if she was gathering intelligence about these strangers who were planning to dismantle her mistress's legacy. Marcus watched with growing concern as Princess shadowed the women through the garden. The little Corgi maintained a respectful distance, but her attention never wavered from their conversation. When they paused to examine the memorial bench that King Henry had installed in memory of Queen Eleanor, Princess moved closer, positioning herself protectively near the simple stone marker. The landscape architect noticed the dog's presence and made a dismissive gesture. "We'll need to address the animal situation as well," she said to Lady Seraphina. "Dogs can be quite destructive to formal landscaping. Perhaps a designated area at the far end of the grounds where it can be contained." Lady Seraphina glanced down at Princess with an expression that Marcus could only describe as calculating. "Yes, that will definitely need to be managed," she agreed. "The current arrangement is far too informal for a royal residence." Princess seemed to sense that she was being discussed in terms that boded ill for her future. The dog's posture changed subtly, becoming more alert and defensive. She moved closer to the memorial bench, as if claiming her right to remain in the place where she had spent so many happy hours with Queen Eleanor. Marcus felt a protective surge of anger on Princess's behalf. The little dog had already lost her beloved mistress and had been struggling to find her place in a world that seemed increasingly foreign to her. The idea that she might also lose access to the garden that held so many memories was deeply troubling. As Lady Seraphina and the landscape architect continued their consultation, Princess began exhibiting behavior that Marcus had never seen from her before. The typically well-behaved Corgi started following them more closely, occasionally moving directly into their path as if trying to interrupt their conversation. When they knelt down to examine soil samples, Princess would position herself between them and whatever they were studying, forcing them to work around her presence. "Shoo," Lady Seraphina said with growing irritation, making a dismissive gesture toward Princess. "Go on, go somewhere else." But Princess held her ground, sitting down directly in front of the memorial bench with an expression of quiet determination that reminded Marcus powerfully of Queen Eleanor during her most stubborn moments. The resemblance between the dog's defiant posture and the late queen's unwavering stance on matters of principle was so striking that Marcus had to suppress a smile despite his concern. The landscape architect looked uncomfortable as Princess continued to insert herself into their consultation. "Perhaps we should return when the animal isn't present," she suggested diplomatically. Lady Seraphina's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she maintained her composure. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "This garden belongs to the royal family, not to a pet." The dismissive tone in her voice seemed to galvanize Princess into even more determined resistance. The little dog began moving systematically through the garden, positioning herself in front of each of Queen Eleanor's favorite features as Lady Seraphina pointed them out for removal or replacement. When the women discussed removing the herb garden where the late queen had grown ingredients for her personal tea blends, Princess lay down directly in the middle of the lavender patch. When they examined the butterfly garden that had been Queen Eleanor's pride and joy, Princess sat among the flowering plants like a small, furry guardian. Marcus found himself admiring the dog's instinctive understanding of what was at stake. Princess might not comprehend the technical details of landscape design, but she clearly recognized that these strangers intended to destroy something precious that had belonged to her beloved mistress. The consultation continued for another hour, with Princess maintaining her campaign of passive resistance throughout. By the time Lady Seraphina and the landscape architect concluded their business, both women looked frustrated and somewhat flustered. Princess had successfully turned what should have been a straightforward planning session into an exercise in diplomatic maneuvering around a determined Corgi. As the landscape architect departed with promises to deliver detailed renovation plans within the week, Lady Seraphina remained in the garden, staring down at Princess with an expression that had lost all pretense of regal composure. The two females faced each other in a silent standoff that seemed to crackle with tension. "You're going to be a problem, aren't you?" Lady Seraphina said softly, her voice carrying a note of cold calculation that made Marcus's protective instincts surge. Princess tilted her head slightly, studying the woman who would soon become the palace's new queen. The dog's brown eyes held an intelligence and wariness that suggested she understood far more about the situation than anyone might have expected from a pet. Lady Seraphina took a step closer to Princess, her movement deliberate and somewhat menacing. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "This palace is going to change, and everything in it will adapt or be removed. Everything." The threat in her words was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his hand instinctively tighten on his ceremonial halberd. He was too far away to hear the exact words, but the body language of both woman and dog told him that something significant was happening. Princess didn't back down or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, the little Corgi stood up slowly and walked over to Queen Eleanor's memorial bench, where she lay down with a dignity that would have made her royal mistress proud. The message was clear. This was where she belonged, and this was where she intended to stay. Lady Seraphina stared at the dog for a long moment, her expression cycling through annoyance, calculation, and what might have been a flicker of grudging respect for Princess's determination. Finally, she turned and walked briskly back toward the palace, her heels clicking sharply against the stone path. Marcus waited until Lady Seraphina had disappeared into the palace before approaching Princess. The little dog looked up at him with eyes that seemed older and more tired than they had that morning, as if the confrontation had drained some essential energy from her small body. "That was quite a performance," Marcus said softly, kneeling down to offer Princess a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Queen Eleanor would have been proud of you." Princess leaned into his touch, seeking the comfort and reassurance that seemed increasingly rare in her changing world. Marcus found himself wondering how many more such confrontations the little dog would face in the weeks to come, and whether her determination would be enough to protect the things that mattered most. As he returned to his post, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed more than just a disagreement about garden design. The confrontation between Princess and Lady Seraphina had revealed fundamental differences in their understanding of what Ravencrest Palace represented and what it should become. For Princess, the palace was a living repository of memories, traditions, and connections that deserved to be preserved and honored. For Lady Seraphina, It seemed to be primarily a stage for displaying her own vision of modern royal life, regardless of what might be lost in the process. Marcus realized that Princess had appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of Queen Eleanor's legacy, a role that would inevitably put her in direct conflict with the woman who was about to become the new queen. The little Corgi's brave stand in the garden had been just the beginning of what promised to be a much larger battle for the soul of Ravencrest Palace. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself thinking about loyalty, duty, and the different forms they could take. His own oath was to protect the royal family and uphold the traditions of his position, but what happened when those traditions conflicted with the wishes of the future queen? Where did his ultimate loyalty lie? With the crown itself, or with the values that had made that crown worth serving? These questions would soon become more than philosophical abstractions. Marcus sensed that changes were coming to Ravencrest Palace that would test every member of the staff, forcing them to choose between their comfortable routines and their deeper convictions. For now, Princess continued her vigil in the garden, a small but determined guardian of memories that others seemed eager to erase. Marcus wondered how long her lonely resistance could continue, and what would happen when the pressure to conform became too great for even the bravest little dog to withstand. The morning of the confrontation that would change everything at Ravencrest Palace dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds promising rain before the day was through. Captain Marcus Thornfield had been awake since before sunrise, unable to shake a feeling of unease that had been building for days. Something was coming. He could sense it in the subtle changes in routine, the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, and the worried glances exchanged between longtime palace staff members. The previous week had brought a series of unwelcome changes. Lady Seraphina's landscape architect had begun work in Queen Eleanor's garden, and the sound of machinery tearing up beloved flower beds had created a constant background of destruction that set everyone's nerves on edge. Princess had been banned from the garden during the renovation, a restriction that had left the little Corgi visibly distressed and more restless than ever. Butler Harrison had been dismissed 2 days ago, officially for inefficiency in adapting to modern operational standards, but everyone knew the real reason was his gentle refusal to implement Lady Seraphina's more dramatic changes to palace protocol. The man who had served the royal family for 4 decades was given barely an hour to pack his belongings before being escorted from the premises. The sight of the dignified old butler walking away from the only home he had known as an adult had brought tears to many eyes. Mrs. Wells had submitted her resignation that same evening, though Lady Seraphina had convinced her to stay through the wedding by offering a substantial increase in salary. Marcus suspected that Mrs. Wells remained not for the money, but because she couldn't bear to abandon the younger staff members who looked to her for guidance during these turbulent times. The wedding was now only 5 days away, and the palace buzzed with activity as final preparations were completed. Lady Seraphina had thrown herself into creating what she called a celebration worthy of a modern monarchy, with elaborate decorations, exotic flowers flown in from distant countries, and a guest list that included more celebrities and business leaders than traditional nobility. Prince Edmund seemed overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the event his bride had planned. Marcus had observed the young prince becoming increasingly withdrawn as the wedding approached, though whether this was normal pre-wedding nerves or something deeper was difficult to determine. The prince's natural kindness and consideration for others seemed to be at odds with some of the more dramatic changes being implemented in his name. King Henry remained largely absent from the preparations, spending most of his time in meetings with government officials or locked away in his private study. The grief-stricken monarch appeared to have little energy for wedding festivities, and Marcus suspected that the changes happening around the palace were as painful for him as they were for the staff. It was against this backdrop of tension and change that Marcus received the most troubling news yet. Mrs. Wells approached him during his afternoon rounds, her usually composed expression showing signs of deep distress. "Captain Thornfield," she said, in a voice that shook slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I need to speak with you privately. It's about Princess." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he followed Mrs. Wells to a quiet alcove away from the main corridors. The housekeeper's face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she delivered news that would shatter any remaining illusions about Lady Seraphina's intentions. "She's arranged for Princess to be given away," Mrs. Wells said without preamble. "Tomorrow morning, before the final wedding preparations begin. A family from the countryside has agreed to take her. Lady Seraphina claims it's for Princess's own good, that the stress of palace life is unhealthy for an animal." Marcus felt a surge of anger so intense that it took all his years of military discipline to keep his voice steady. "Does Prince Edmund know about this?" Mrs. Wells shook her head sadly. "He's been told that Princess needs temporary relocation during the wedding festivities. Lady Seraphina assured him that the dog would return after the honeymoon. But I've seen the paperwork. The transfer of ownership is permanent." The betrayal was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Lady Seraphina was removing the last living link to Queen Eleanor's reign, while the king was distracted by state business and the prince was overwhelmed by wedding preparations. By the time either of them realized what had happened, Princess would be gone forever. "Who's supposed to handle the transfer?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A palace courier is coming at dawn to collect her," Mrs. Wells confirmed. "Lady Seraphina wants it done quietly, before the household is fully awake. She's ordered me to have Princess ready for transport." Marcus studied the housekeeper's distressed expression and made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Mrs. Wells," he said quietly, "I think you should be too busy with wedding preparations to handle this particular task yourself." Mrs. Wells looked at him with surprise and dawning hope. "But if I don't prepare Princess for transport, Lady Seraphina will want to know why." "Let me worry about Lady Seraphina," Marcus replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "You just focus on your other duties tomorrow morning. I'll handle everything else." The housekeeper nodded gratefully, understanding that Marcus was offering to take responsibility for whatever consequences might arise from defying the future queen's orders. It was a generous gesture from a man whose own position would be at risk if things went wrong. Marcus spent the rest of the day making his own preparations. He reviewed the palace's security protocols, confirmed the schedules of the other guards, and mentally rehearsed the conversation he expected to have with Lady Seraphina when she discovered that her orders had not been followed. That evening he made a point of visiting Princess in the small sitting room where she had been staying since being banned from the garden. The little Corgi looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sadness, and Marcus felt his resolve strengthen as he knelt down to pet her soft fur. "Don't worry, girl," he whispered. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home, and it's going to stay your home." Princess seemed to sense the reassurance in his voice, resting her head against his hand with a trust that made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion. He thought about Queen Eleanor and the promises he had made, both spoken and unspoken, to protect the things that mattered most about Ravencrest Palace. The next morning arrived with the promised rain, a steady downpour that turned the palace grounds gray and somber. Marcus took up his position early, stationing himself where he would have a clear view of the main entrance and the courtyard where any courier would be expected to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, a modest carriage pulled up to the palace gates. Marcus watched as a middle-aged man in simple country clothes climbed down from the driver's seat and approached the entrance with the nervous manner of someone unaccustomed to royal surroundings. This would be the courier, Marcus realized, come to collect Princess and transport her to her new life, away from everything she had ever known. The man carried a small traveling cage, and wore the expression of someone who was simply following orders without questioning their moral implications. Marcus intercepted the courier at the entrance, his ceremonial uniform and authoritative bearing immediately commanding respect and attention. "I understand you're here about the Corgi," Marcus said in a tone that brooked no argument. "I'm afraid there's been a change in plans." The courier looked confused and somewhat intimidated. "But I have orders from Lady Seraphina herself. I'm to collect the dog and transport it to the Weatherby farm in Kent." "Those orders have been rescinded," Marcus replied with calm authority. "The dog will be remaining at the palace." Before the courier could respond, Lady Seraphina herself appeared at the entrance, having apparently been watching for his arrival. Her expression shifted from satisfaction to anger as she took in the scene before her. "Captain Thornfield," she said in a voice that carried the chill of winter frost. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marcus turned to face her, drawing himself up to his full height and meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm preventing a mistake, your ladyship. Princess belongs here at Ravencrest Palace." Lady Seraphina's eyes flashed with fury, but she maintained her composure in front of the confused courier. "You are overstepping your authority, Captain. I gave specific orders regarding that animal." "And I'm afraid I cannot follow those orders," Marcus replied steadily. "Princess was Queen Eleanor's beloved companion. Removing her from the palace would dishonor the memory of our late queen." The confrontation had attracted the attention of several staff members, who gathered at a respectful distance to witness this unprecedented challenge to Lady Seraphina's authority. Mrs. Wells appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry, while other longtime servants watched with mixture of fear and admiration for Marcus's courage. Lady Seraphina stepped closer to Marcus, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You forget yourself, Captain. I will soon be queen of this realm, and you will obey my commands or face the consequences." Marcus felt the weight of 23 years of faithful service, of promises made to Queen Eleanor, of loyalty to the true spirit of Ravencrest Palace. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet strength of absolute conviction. "My oath was to protect and serve the crown and all it represents," he said clearly, ensuring that everyone present could hear his words. Queen Eleanor loved that little dog with all her heart, and Princess loved her in return. That bond represents something sacred about this palace and this monarchy. I will not be party to destroying it for the sake of convenience or modern fashion. The silence that followed was profound. Even the rain seemed to pause as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what had just occurred. A palace guard had openly defied the future queen, risking everything to protect a small corgi and the memory of a beloved monarch. Lady Seraphina's face had gone white with rage, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Captain Thornfield is absolutely right." Everyone turned to see Prince Edmund approaching, his usually gentle expression showing an uncharacteristic firmness. The prince had apparently been listening from just inside the entrance, and his intervention changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Mother loved Princess," Prince Edmund continued, moving to stand beside Marcus in a gesture of solidarity. "That dog was one of the few things that brought her comfort during her illness. I should never have agreed to send her away, even temporarily." Lady Seraphina's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. "Edmund, we discussed this. The animal is disruptive and inappropriate for a modern royal household." Prince Edmund shook his head, and for the first time since his engagement, he looked truly royal. "No, Seraphina. We didn't discuss it. You told me it was temporary, and I was too distracted to pay proper attention. But Captain Thornfield has reminded me of what's truly important." The prince knelt down as Princess appeared at the entrance, having somehow sensed that her fate was being decided. The little corgi approached cautiously, then broke into a run when she recognized Edmund's welcoming gesture. The reunion between the prince and his mother's beloved pet was touching to witness, and several of the watching servants had tears in their eyes. "Princess stays," Prince Edmund declared as he stood up with the Corgi in his arms. "She belongs here, and she always will." Lady Seraphina looked around at the assembled group, her expression cycling through rage, calculation, and finally a cold acceptance that this particular battle was lost. The courier, meanwhile, was backing toward his carriage with obvious relief, clearly wanting no part of whatever royal drama was unfolding before him. "Very well," Lady Seraphina said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "But don't think this matter is closed. There will be consequences for this insubordination." Marcus met her threatening gaze without wavering. "I understand, your ladyship, but some things are worth the consequences." As Lady Seraphina stormed back into the palace and the courier departed empty-handed, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. He had chosen honor over obedience, loyalty to true principles over convenient compliance. Whatever punishment might come, he could face it knowing that he had done the right thing. Prince Edmund approached him with Princess still in his arms. "Thank you, Captain," the prince said quietly. "You reminded me of who I'm supposed to be." Marcus bowed respectfully. "It was my honor, Your Highness. Queen Eleanor would be proud of both of you." As the rain continued to fall and the palace staff slowly dispersed, Marcus returned to his post with a lighter heart. Princess was safe. Prince Edmund had found his backbone, and the true spirit of Ravencrest Palace had been preserved against those who would diminish it. The wedding would still take place in a few days, and Lady Seraphina would indeed become queen. But Marcus had helped ensure that not everything precious about the palace would be sacrificed to her vision of modernity. Sometimes, he reflected, standing firm was the most important service a guard could provide. Princess, now secure in Prince Edmund's arms, looked back at Marcus with eyes that seemed to sparkle with something that might have been gratitude. In that moment, Marcus felt the presence of Queen Eleanor's spirit, approving of his choice to protect the small, loyal creature who had brought so much joy to her final years. The battle for the soul of Ravencrest Palace would continue, but Marcus had won an important victory. He had proven that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to say no, even to those in power. And in protecting Princess, he had protected something far more valuable than a pet. He had preserved a piece of the love and compassion that made the palace worthy of service. As he stood at his post, watching Prince Edmund carry Princess inside where she belonged, Marcus felt the satisfaction of duty truly fulfilled. Some stands were worth taking, regardless of the cost, and some loyalties ran deeper than any chain of command.